Frederick Nabeck. I'm the Managing Director for MedTech Innovator, based here in Singapore. With me is the MedTech Innovator Singapore team. We have Bernice, Jermaine, Narissa, and Linus here. Today's topic is commercialization. It's about driving sales, building and maintaining distribution channels. And we'll look at this from an Asia-Pacific angle as well as from a US angle. And I think it's appropriate that we wrap up our webinar series with this topic. We've covered over the last several weeks raising capital. We've covered working with strategics. We've covered reimbursement, running hospital pilots. We've talked about talent. Today is our final webinar in the series before our grand finals and showcase event later this month on the 20th, which will happen on the 28th of October here in Singapore. Open to all, free to join. Have a look at our website to get more information about that. So that was my quick plug for the grand finals. I'm thrilled to have an outstanding panel here with us today. I'm delighted to introduce, and I'll have them introduce themselves in a moment. We have Ajish Ashraf here, Managing Partner at Blue Box Advancements. Good morning, Ajish. Great to have you here. We have Adam Stedman here as well, CEO at MDD Options, dialing in from North Carolina, I believe. So thank you, Adam, for staying up really late and talking to us this evening.
No problem. You're very welcome.
So maybe let's begin with having each of you introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about your background, what you've done in the area of sales, marketing, sales distribution and marketing, and in the area of medtech commercialization. Adam, maybe I'll begin with you.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Fred. Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today. So I've been around a while. Some of us have been in the business, if you like, for many, many years. I've been very broad and not very deep. I have over 20 years experience in CRO worlds mainly. I have run since 2012 a clinical trial distribution business. And I'm actually on my 11th startup right now. So 11 startups later, there's a lot of selling, a lot of commercialization, a lot of thinking about how to make money out of that and how to actually make the process work. I'm a chartered accountant by training. Who would know? I try to avoid that.
We won't hold that against you, Adam.
Exactly. So yeah, I've been in the business for a while, but what I'm doing at the moment, I run a company called MDD Options. MDD Options is a distribution, a hybrid distribution model here in the States. I'll mention a little bit of that as we go through. I'm not going to do this as a major plug for my own business, but there are some, it's a passion project for me, and there are some real issues and problems that we're trying to address here. That's why I've set up the passion project. That's why I'm doing it, to actually try and resolve some of these issues getting into the market in the US. So I'll be very happy to be talking about that as we talk through the discussion.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Ajish, over to you.
Good morning, Adam. Good morning, Frederick and Adam. So my name is Ajish Ashraf. My experience in the MedTech work is that I was with Johnson & Johnson for over 20 years, mostly in their MedTech business, 12 years in Europe, 8 years here in Asia. Cut my teeth in sales for the very first time as a sales manager of Paris for Johnson & Johnson MedTech. Did a lot of work around commercial excellence, commercialization. In Asia, managed a lot of distributors, ran commercial excellence for Johnson & Johnson's MedTech and vision care business. About 18 months ago, I've started my own business called Blue Box Advancements, and where we look at commercialization of MedTech, and that's my wheelhouse. And I help startups, I help mid to small to medium-sized companies, looking at commercialization, looking at managing distributors, looking at managing channels, and in Asia.
Great background, both of you. Thank you for those introductions. So aligns perfectly well, of course, with today's topic. So let's dive in. Before we go into the details, though, a quick reminder to our cohort companies that are on the call. I think you know the drill by now. Please queue up your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to everyone's Q&A at the top of the hour. So let's begin let's talk about when when a startup should start thinking about commercialization, and perhaps, and I think everyone hears that it should really be as early as possible, but surely there is a time when it's too early. We surveyed our cohort companies at the beginning of the accelerator program and asked them to provide questions that they wanted answered, and we did have one question about startups establishing their commercial presence and whether they should do it even before they move into manufacturing and before they apply for regulatory approval, or whether that should happen in parallel, or whether commercialization is something you should address later. What are your perspectives on the timing of when this needs to get full attention of a startup founder and CEO? And Ajish, let me start with you.
Yeah. Thank you, Frederick. And I think you're right. The answer is as soon as possible. But there are two things, right? One is understanding your commercial go-to-market model. And then the second part is actually starting to implement them.
Right.
So even if the implementation can wait a little bit, I think really thinking about how you're going to take the product to the market early on has a lot of implications. For example, if you're saying, hey, my product, I'm going to sell on a pay-per-use model, that was going to be then you need to probably make product design changes that will support a pay-per-use model.
Yeah.
So really thinking about how you would sell the product early on will have great implications on your product design. Or it could be, something, oh, I'm not going to sell this to surgeons, I'm going to sell this to GPs. And therefore, for example, I need to make my product a lot easier to use. And so those are design consideration right at the product design phase that one would consider. Another area where that would come in also is, for example, when you're saying, this is the customer that I want to sell to, your trials need to make sure that the needs of that customer, you are trying to capture the proof of the value of the product that you're building early on. So your clinical trials or your economic value trials need to be designed to make sure that that is there. So what I would say is really try to think through which markets, at least at a very high level, what kind of stakeholders you're going to sell this to, how you're going to sell this to, and think about what are the product, regulatory, or other design changes that you need to make early on to support your final commercial model.
Great advice. Thanks for that, Ajish. Adam, love your perspectives on this as well.
Well, I agree with that completely. I mean, if you think about when you're developing a device, the first thing you're thinking about is, can it do what you want it to do? But at the end of the day, if you're trying to help patients and save lives and all the rest of it, you can only do that if you commercialize. If you don't commercialize, everything is of no value. And so it's really critical right from day one. When you think about, I'm going to go into business, I've got an idea here, I want to develop it, you've got to have that commercial thought in your mind. How am I going to commercialize it? How am I going to convert it into money? Because if you can't, you'll never get funding, you'll never get what you need, you'll never get the grants, you'll never get what you need to get your product to market. And obviously, getting your product to market is key. If you don't do that, don't bother. So that it's got to be thought of that early. I think one of the really important points that I've seen many times, and Ajish alluded to this as well, is if you don't plan things properly, you end up doing things multiple times or too late or having delays and so forth. In clinical trials, if you don't design your trials properly to get the right endpoints and to get the right economic information and all the rest of it, then you have to do additional trials. That costs enormous amounts of money. And causes delays. And not only does that cost money, but that's also one of those situations where, we see it as MedTech Innovator reviewers and judges. Guys out there think they've got the only product on the market that's coming out with this, and we see that there's 5 people in it this year doing the same thing. Well, if you want to be a year suddenly behind everyone else, because this is the new flavor of the month that's come out, go for it. But by poor planning and not thinking about your commercial strategy early enough, you may never actually get there, because you may be beaten to the goalposts. But having said all that, yes, obviously you've got to think of it early. You need to think of it in in everything you do. You've got to always keep that commercial perspective. But then when it comes to actual commercial planning and getting into the details of it, don't leave it till you've got your approval. You've got to do it in advance of your approval or your clearance. I can't tell you how many people I've spoken to who've said, well, we'll get our 510K in November and we'll talk to you then. What, you're then going to wait for a year before you start bringing in revenue, which is what they do. Because their whole goalpost is getting that 510K or the PMA or whatever it happens to be. And that's all they're focusing on. You have to go commercial, think about commercial before then, and you have to hit the ground running. There's a thing called the Valley of Death, and the Valley of Death isn't prior to clinical trials. It isn't prior to clearance. It's when you get your clearance, and now everyone said, well, now you've got everything you wanted, how quickly can you bring in the revenue to cover the costs? And that Valley of Death is what catches most. And that is because there's not enough advanced planning to shorten the length of that, shallow out the valley, shall we say. So that's my view.
Yeah, great point. Great point. So start early, think about your overall go-to-market strategy, think about your revenue model. And that's, I think, a good segue for us to talk a bit about commercial models. And Ajish, you worked for a long time in Asia Pacific, and it's a heterogeneous bunch of markets. It's not easy. Every market perhaps requires its own commercial strategy. And so maybe just tell us a bit about the alternative commercial models that exist here. You have, of course, direct sales operations. You have indirect working through distributors. You've got hybrid models. What are the differences? Is there a sort of a natural evolution for a startup company to first work indirect, then build it into hybrid, and eventually aim to go direct? Just your relatively high-level perspective on this in APAC and how you might want to segment the different markets here.
Right. So, Frederick, there are multiple parameters that one could consider while looking at, should I go direct, should I go indirect, should I go hybrid? But for the purpose of discussion, I'm going to select just two parameters. The first parameter that I would look at is the product itself. Now, if your product is highly innovative, it needs a lot of surgeon or clinician training. It might need a certain amount of customization. Then it makes sense to be direct in the first place. If your product is something for which the treatment methodology already exists, the clinicians know how to use a similar product, and your product is either faster, better, cheaper, in some form. But the surgeons, the clinicians, the treatment pathway, the treatment methodology already exists, and then there is not a lot of training required. Not a lot of hand-holding required. Then you might think about an indirect. So first parameter is to look at your product. What is it? Is it very innovative, or is it, already, methodology exists? The second parameter you want to look at is the landscape of the market. Now, there are certain markets that you will find that are few urban areas with a lot of concentration of key customers, etc. And certain markets where the region is very spread out. There is a lot of big regions. The customers are very spread out. And in these markets, you tend to have customarily a distributor model. We're talking India, China, etc. And so then you might want to go with that. So I would just use two parameters as my initial check, the type of product you have and the landscape of that country, to then say, do I want to go direct here? Do I want to go indirect here? Or do I want to go hybrid? Now, a lot of companies do tend to go hybrid, and it's and one of them, I think we can speak a little bit more about it later in the discussion. But one of the most important things that the companies need to sit down and really work through in a hybrid model is about who does what. What I've usually seen at a very, very high level is that the distributor will do logistics, delivery, supply chain of the product to the customer, and then the others depends on the principal and the distributor, right? So For example, marketing may be something that the principal, the company would take on its own. Another area which I've seen is very interesting is when is the company saying, you know what, I will have 1 or 2 salespeople and I will focus on these 10 key customers and I'll let my distributor do the sales in all the other customers.
Okay, so sort of a key account management segmentation.
Correct. So they will pick out 10 accounts and say, okay, you know, these are not for the distributor. I will manage myself, and the rest I'll have the distributor's model.
Yeah.
And so those are some of the ways you could build a hybrid. Building a hybrid model is essentially just going down list of a lot of tasks and saying who can do this best, and how do we do that?
Yeah, but it raises some challenges in terms of actually managing that that list of tasks, so there is no conflict between what your own team does and what the distributor does. We'll come to some of those things in a moment. Thanks, Ajish, for that. Adam, the US perspective on this. If you look at this at a high level, what are typically the models of selling to hospitals in the US, and why would a company want to go direct, building their own sales force, and why would they want to work through a third-party channel in the US? What are some of the pros and cons?
Well, thank you, Fred. I think the first thing to comment on is just to put it in context with Asia. So when I think about Asia, I'm thinking about China and Japan and Korea and Thailand and whichever country it happens to be. And when you're looking at that, you've got different cultures, you've got different languages, you've got very different situations, and it's very hard to have an individual or even an individual organization that can cover all of that. So you tend to go out and get regionally specific support. We all talk about the United States as though it's one country. I like to tell people it's the 50 United States. And the reason I say that is they're all different. It's like going to Europe. You've got 28 countries in Europe. Well, you've got 50 states in the US. And while we have the regulation here in the US, the 510K, the PMA, the FDA pathways, and so forth, we have state level regulations as well that have a big impact. And so that adds a dimension that changes the dynamic somewhat. So all the comments that Ajish made were very valid. I like the way he put it very simply into the sort of the two areas. And the same applies here. If I had a aortic arch repair kit, there's probably 30 hospitals in the country that use it. So does it matter that we've got 50 states? Well, no. I did my clinical trials here anyhow. I've been doing them for the last 7 years. I know every KOL in the business. I know who's going to use that product. That's a very narrow use case. But the problem is, well, you're not going to get a distributor to manage that, because that really wouldn't be an efficient way of doing it. You're going to bring in technical expertise that can really speak to those surgeons. But what you've got to now manage is, well, hold on, now I've got to worry about all the state level regulations that I've got to meet. You've got to be registered in 24 of the states to be able to even sell products into those states. And you've got a whole lot of other requirements. So you don't really have an option but to go with a direct model. But again, we're talking about a hybrid here. You actually need something that gives you the logistics, but also gives you the other components of it. So that's a little bit of a pitch for what I'm doing, because that's why I'm doing what I'm doing, because that's a real problem. The alternative you've got, and again, looking at what kind of markets you've got and how deep they are and so forth. I mean, if, I've spoken about an aortic arch repair kit, and the other end of it is a wearable. Well, a wearable could be sold with maybe a website, social media. That's how companies like Whoop and so forth are doing this. A lot of them are putting on sporting events. Garmin are doing a lot of that. Completely different way of doing things. And in that case, maybe a distributor does work. So I think you've got different options. You've got distributors, you've got independent distributor networks. One of the problems you've got with the distributor, if you're looking for a global or national distributor, is they are huge. I mean, the US is big. The market is big. Medline alone does $2 billion a month in sales. You're a startup. Where do you think you're going to sit on their list if you go to Medline and get national distributorship with them? I mean, if you're number 5,000 on their list, you're lucky. So that's another of the challenges we've got here. I think we have scale, which is good in some respects and really awful in others. We have state-by-state regulations to think about. We have a lot of flexibility with what we call 1099s, contractors that are independent.
Yeah,
They're
maybe
free
tell us a
to
bit
work.
about that, because it's something that's fairly unique to the US, and a lot of startups are thinking, well, can I get these freelance reps, that so-called 1099s, to help me
Yeah.
out and
So
minimize risk?
the 1099, the phrase comes from the form that you have to fill in and send to the IRS, the
Okay,
Internal
it's a
Revenue
tax
Service.
form
Yeah. And basically
number.
what it says is you're an independent rep, and there are certain rules that define this. You can't work full time for somebody and claim to be an independent rep or an independent contractor. You have to demonstrate that you're responsible for doing your own activities, that you're not being guided by somebody else. You have to demonstrate that you're using your own equipment. You have to demonstrate you have multiple clients and so forth. So there's a whole bunch of rules around that, but there's lots of them out there. And of course, um, they can work extremely efficiently in certain areas. Um, a lot of them are very, very experienced people. And if you can find the right people and the right networks, now there's apps you can use, there's associations you can join, you can network at meetings, you can talk to your KOLs. When you're talking to the target hospitals and so forth you're trying to get into, you can say to them, well, who do you like working with? And they can say, well, I like Joe Smith here. Well, if he likes Joe Smith, that means Joe Smith can get him on the phone. Joe Smith's a really nice guy to have on your team at that point in time. Again, though, it comes back to, well, hold on, we still got logistics to manage. And logistics isn't using DHL or Kerner Nagel or something like that, because you've got all the state-by-state regulations. You've got individual sales tax regulations state by state. You've got different rules for the Secretary of State, which is your corporate company's office type things you have to deal with as well. You've got income tax. Every year when I do my taxes, I do a federal income tax return and North Carolina tax return. Well, if you're doing business in 50 states as a foreign company, you have to do a federal tax return and 46, because not all of them charge. 46 states you have to submit state income tax returns to and pay the taxes. There's all sorts of things to think about that people don't really consider. So I always look at it this way. You go distribution, indirect. It's the easiest way to do it, but generally it's not the most efficient. It's easy, but if you go that route, you lose control of your sales, you lose control of your market, you lose control, you're a small number and you will be treated like a small number. If you go direct, you're either looking at very high expense or you're looking at a lot of management required or somewhere in between. So it is difficult to go direct, but again, that's very much a depends question. It's how complex is my product, and to Ajish's point, is it going broad? Is it going deep? Makes a big difference either way.
Yeah. Great points there, Adam. And we'll come back to some of these in a moment. I just wanted to check in briefly with Ajish. This whole concept of independent reps, does that even exist in Asia Pacific? You're on mute.
Not in Asia Pacific. I've seen some of this in Europe to a certain extent, but I have not seen or used it in Asia Pacific.
Okay. Ajish, just stay with you for a second. Getting a commercial leader on board in a new organization, when does it make sense to do that? And typically, from your experience, what are the types of skills and qualities that are most important for a startup in starting to build that commercial organization?
Okay. When I think about commercial skills, so to speak, I like to think of it in three different levels. The first is having a good idea of commercial strategy. And so commercial strategy is to say, okay, which country am I going to go sell in? Or which customer segment should I focus on? Or which channel should I use? These are all strategic questions that a commercial leader needs to answer first. Once you have answered these very high level strategic questions, the next level is operations. And so what I would call commercial operations. And these could be stuff like pricing, contracts, or if you're working with the distributor, your margins or your performance incentive, etc. Or the sales systems that you want to build, the CRM systems, or if you have a direct sales force, the kind of incentive plans. And so the second level of skills that I would look for in a commercial person is how good are they in operations? Can they do all these kind of operational work? The third level in commercial skills, I would say, is the actual sales skills.
Right.
And so these are they very good at relationship building? Do they know how to listen? And do they understand how to sell solutions? Are they able to be very good at storytelling and provide, delivering the message, the actual process of
Yeah.
sales? And most importantly, are they good at coaching these sales skills to the
Right.
rest of the commercial team? And so from a commercial, let's say, leader, these are the three levels that I would expect. Do they have
Right.
good strategic sense? Do they understand operations of a commercial organizations? And do they know how to sell themselves
Right.
so that they can coach the rest of the team?
Yeah. Great point. And would these skills still be required even if you were selling through a distributor and indirect organization? I think I know the answer to this, but
Yes. Absolutely. Maybe less on the sales part where the
yeah.
actual sales where the distributor has the sales team.
Yeah.
But you definitely need to be on top of your commercial strategy and commercial
Yeah.
operations,
Yeah.
and distributor management in this case.
And particularly, I guess, if you as a principal want to own some of those KOL relationships, you need to know how to build and maintain those relationships.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great point. Um, we've spoken a bit about Adam. We've spoken a bit about the distributors and roles of distributors in Asia Pacific. Distributors in the US, are they fundamentally the same, or do they operate quite differently? I mean, you have experience of both. Are they smaller, more focused? Are they more logistics oriented? Um, Same or different?
I suspect they're the same. Um, I mean, we have the range, we have the full gamut.
Mm,
You can go from very small companies, very regional companies, and very local companies, quite frankly. And it needs to necessarily be sometimes when it's DME, for instance, durable medical equipment going direct to patient, because you can't service that business line in most
mm,
states unless you're local to the business. So you get that. You get independent distribution networks where you've got a bunch of independents that have sort of pulled together in working in the same space. You've got the massive companies, as I've mentioned, people like Medline, Cardinal Health, and so forth. And those companies, one of the things to remember with the big companies is you've got to be very careful with your due diligence. You can be a little bit starstruck with some of them because when you get a commercial director from Medline talking to you and his line is $500 million worth of business a year. Your eyes are popping and thinking, wow,
mm,
that's just amazing and so forth. But you've got to be very careful when you're working with them. One thing is they always want a contract. They want probably a 3 or 4 year contract, um, maybe a 2 year if you're lucky. But they look for that, which I'm sure is probably the same in Asia. It certainly is the same in Europe. And the reason for that is they're going to develop a market. At least that's the point of view they have. If you're developing a market and you're investing in it, you don't want somebody just to be able to pull it away from you. But the thing you've got to be very careful about is, are they going to park your product?
mm,
Because sometimes you could have a product that's competing with what they're already selling for somebody else, or that they have as their own internal line. And if you don't do your due diligence and look at their line card of 5,000 other products they happen to have, you might find your wound care product is in direct competition with one of theirs, but
mm.
yours is slightly better. Well, they might just park yours to keep selling theirs. So you've got to do your due diligence, be careful. And the big guys, they're pretty ruthless. They don't care. They're just they've got a quarterly number to hit.
Yeah.
Everything drives towards that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I don't know if that happens in Asia. I suspect it probably does. But you've got the whole range of company of
Mm, mm.
distribution companies in the US.
Yeah, thanks for that. And we'll come to the exact roles of distributors in Asia in just a moment. Um, Ajish, in terms of identifying distributors and finding an optimal distribution partner, where should a startup begin? It's easy to attend trade shows, but I think Adam mentioned earlier talking to clinicians and having them actually recommend someone. What's your experience? What's the best way to find these people?
Yeah, I think you've mentioned some of them, but you're absolutely right. I would always go to the KOL and say, who are the best, distributors who are serving you. But there's another the party in the hospital that one should speak to, and I have got very good intel from them. It's the allied staff. So we're probably talking about the head nurse
Mm.
or the allied staff who actually deal with a lot of the distributors and stuff, and they tend to have a lot of very good information.
Good point.
And so I would never just only focus on the KOL. I would
Yeah.
also, if you're at the hospital, talk to the allied staff, the head nurse, etc., who might have some very good intel about what good distributors they are working with in that hospital. And you have one or two of these discussions, and you get a good idea. Other than this, there are directories out there that have details of distributors. I think Volsa by Medis exist. There are companies that do this. There's a company called DCCL, for example, in Singapore, and others who are actually able to go out and look at all the different distributors and select distributors for you. Another area that I would look at is complementary products.
Mm.
And so if you're new and saying, you know what, my product, but I know that when my product gets used, this product also gets used, I would then look at who are the distributors for that product and say, would that be the right distributor? So complementary product would be another thing that I would look at, and definitely trade shows. But trade shows that are more focused on the trade side of things, for example, Arab Health and others that you really look at. You have multiple distributors coming there from all over the world to have those discussions. So those were different ways that I would go about trying to find a distributor.
Yeah, good point. And you raised the point of common call points and looking for other adjacent products. And I think that makes a lot of sense, because obviously if you're trying to reach out to an obstetrician, you don't want a distributor that only sees the anesthesiologist.
Absolutely.
That makes perfect sense. So Ajish, and we had Adam talk about this briefly about the role of distributors in the US. In Asia Pacific, what value should distributors bring? What do they do? Should they focus on sales, clinical training, building relationships, or do they typically, for certain products, do they hold consignment inventory? Should they always take care of billing, and are there other roles that typically distributors, in your experience, should take on that may not always be so obvious?
Frederick, I have seen all kinds of distributor relationship. There is no one type of distributor relationship. Every relationship between a principal and a distributor is a unique relationship that needs to be properly thought through, understood, agreed upon, and contracted. And that is how you want to be running a good relationship. It is a relationship,
Yeah.
and therefore you really need to think through. Of all the things you've mentioned, I've seen distributors doing some of it, principals doing some of it. It actually depends on the market, on the needs of the market, on the needs of the product, and the capability of the distributor. Sometimes you might have a distributor who's capable of so many things, but is not able to do this, and therefore you need to figure
Yeah.
out how to best do that. So it's really the idea of looking through. So one, for example, you can really go line by line of all the different things that you need. So you start, for example, with business development. Who's going to be talking to the KOLs? Who is going to be talking to the hospital management? Who is going to be doing that? That's you really look at all the business development. Then you look at marketing and you say, okay, who's going to be presenting at if there is a conference or if there's something that is there, who's going to create the promotional materials? You look at that. Then you look at training and development and say, who's going to train? How is that going to work out? How many trainings should we do in a year? Then you look at clinical support. What kind of clinical support is needed? Who is going to be doing that? Then you look at compliance. Who's going to be making sure that the records and stuff that are needed for who's going to do that? Then you look at operations. So now when you're talking about operations, you're talking about invoicing, you're talking about collection, we're talking about all of those consignment inventory, for example, all of the operations. Who does what? Then you look at the supply chain and say, okay, who does the customs? Who does the transportation to the customer? Who does it? The idea of any relationship is to actually really sit through the
Yeah.
distributor, go line by line. Are you going to do this? Am I going to do this? Are you going to do this? Am I going to do this? And figure that out. Because I've seen all kinds of relationships, with a distributor, and I feel that every relationship needs to be thought of as its unique relationship and thought through. Ideally with a good checklist so that you are not
Yeah.
missing anything when you define that relationship with a distributor.
Yeah, no, I think that's great advice. And of course, if you don't define this upfront in a distributor contract, then you and leaving gray areas, then you're certainly set up to fail and stumble. Adam, is this? I assume this is essentially similar in the US with similar issues, or are there other things in the US that would be different when it comes to maybe contracting with distributors
No, I
regionally or
think it's
across the country?
I think it's very similar. I think you've got to just be careful what you're getting into with those agreements. You've got to have
Mm,
your eyes wide open. As you know, as the innovator, you are very inexperienced in that space compared to the people you're working with or
mm.
contracting with. And it's a rough market out there. They will take advantage when they can. I'm not saying they'll do anything dishonest or anything like that. It's happened. But I'm saying, they're commercially savvy people. They're going to get the best deal they can for their organization. You've got to have help. And that very often means you need to either have the right consultants or the right management team. And it's hard to get the right management team sometimes. Top level commercial officers and so forth are very expensive people here in the States. Your mind will be blown when you see the salaries of some of these people and the compensation packages they have. It's like, oh, now I know why they needed $40 million to launch their product. Um, you know, some of these costs are really significant. So yeah, it's as I say, very similar, but I think you've got to remember that it is a complex
Yeah.
market.
Yeah. So, Adam, in the US, does it make sense to have a distributor support FDA filing and sit in on pre-sub meetings with the FDA?
Absolutely not. I
Okay,
wouldn't
good.
touch it. Honestly, seriously, I would never ever get a distributor involved prior to clearance or approval.
Okay,
I
okay.
don't see any value in that whatsoever. If anything, they would muddy the water.
Yeah.
You have no ability to sell or work with a distributor prior to clearance anyhow.
And
They
does
have
that
no
go for
business
payers
being
as well?
involved.
And working on reimbursement challenges in the US, is that something you want to keep your distributor out of, or does it make sense to involve them in that?
That's a good question. I would generally say that think of your distributor as being the sales organization and your manufacturer or innovator being the marketing organization. I haven't seen a lot of marketing coming out of distributors. Um, and what I mean by that is I don't recall ever going along and seeing Cardinal Health or Medline sitting at NAS or at
Mm,
ASH or any of these other meetings. Um, and in general terms, I think you as the manufacturer, you know your product intimately. You should be responsible for scientific sessions, for papers, for um, proving the value of your product, getting reimbursement, even supporting reimbursement codes and helplines for what is your reimbursement strategy for this particular institution. Um, and then let the sales activities, very specifically the sales activities, sit with the distributor. I wouldn't let the distributor any closer than that. I don't
mm.
think they should get involved in strategies for getting your clearance. They shouldn't be involved in your demand messaging. You should be controlling that as a manufacturer. That's my personal view on it.
Good point. Thank you for that. Ajish, the APAC perspective on that. It's easy when you have so many markets here, it's easy to kind of let go and just have the distributor go out there and sort out distribution and sort out regulatory approval and take care of that. Is that problematic or is that a good idea sometimes?
Um, I think from a regulatory approval point of view, And then there are two kinds of approvals, right? So we're talking from a clinical approval and from the commercial registration point of view. Now, if we're talking about clinical approvals and working with entities like the HSA or the Thai FDA and stuff like that, I would totally recommend not including the distributor, but having agencies that are very focused on getting regulatory approvals. If you need help, work with these agencies that get healthcare regulatory approvals. Now, that's on the clinical side of
Right.
getting the approvals. But on the registration side, now all of these countries will require registration of the product from a commercial sales point of view. That you can use a distributor. And one of the things that I would say when it comes to registration of a product in a market,
So
and this
this
is
would
what
be,
I'm
sorry, this would be like having a marketing authorization holder or
correct.
filing for free sales certificate, this sort of thing.
Correct. So what I'm talking about is
Yeah.
commercial registration,
Yeah.
not the clinical side, but the clinical approval, but the commercial registration. What I would very strongly ask the countries to do is looking at each country, see how that is set up. For example, there are some countries where multiple entities can hold the registration and license for a product. And there are some countries where only one entity can hold the registration and license for a product. And that has a big impact on how you're going to say, hey, should I let the distributor just manage the registration and licensing, or should I hold it myself? The advantage of having the distributor doing the registration, commercial registration, it's just lesser cost for you, and it's easier. They know the process, so they'll get it done faster. The problem is, if it is a single registration country, then you are stuck with that distributor.
Yeah.
If he or she, the distributor, does not push a product and it's sitting on the shelf, there's nothing you can do. You can't just go to the next distributor and say, hey, would you like to sell this? You are stuck with that distributor. What I have seen very interestingly is there are now companies that you can go around this. So, for example, in Indonesia, where there is only a single holder allowed, there are companies whose entire purpose is just to hold the registration. They don't do any distribution, they don't do anything else. All they do is to register your product and hold the license. And then you can decide which distributor you want to use. And therefore, that way, even though you don't have an entity in Indonesia, you have this other entity that's
Right.
holding your license, and that's all they do. And then you can decide which distributor you want to use and change distributors accordingly. And so that's one of the things. So there are countries where there is single holders. Like, for example, in Japan and South Korea, it's primarily single holder. You want to be careful. India, Singapore, Malaysia, you have multiple, multiple folks can have the registration. So you really need to look at what is best for you when you look at the commercial registration process.
Right. Great point there. Um, the other complexity, of course, in Asia Pacific is in some of the markets you have multiple or multi-layered or multi-tiered distribution networks. And especially in countries like Japan and Korea and Taiwan and China and so on. Things to consider for a startup trying to navigate that. And as general trends, do you see that going away? Is there a consolidation of distribution networks happening in Asia? I know China several years ago started this two invoice system where they're trying to reduce the number of the number of stages between an importer and a hospital receiving the product. Your perspectives on that area of complexity?
Where I've seen this happen is, again, going back to the landscape, when you have large numbers of small hospitals or regional health systems, and when you have that, and coupled with what I would call relationship selling. When you have large number of hospitals, smaller hospitals, and relationship selling, that is very, very important. We see this happening, the
Yeah.
second
You need
layer,
to have your
the third
local
layer.
dealer that only services 2 or 3 hospitals in Nagoya, whatever it may be.
Pretty much. And that's where you really see those kinds of distributors. And the fact of the matter is you need those bottom, those distributors there, because those are the only ones who have the airtime with the clinicians in those smaller areas, etc. Another small factor that biases this is also if your product is not just a one-time sale product, but it requires servicing or it requires some kind of assistance that goes with the product, and that means you need kind of boots on the ground in all these places. So from what I can see, yes, there are countries, for example, Japan, Korea, and China. These are the top three where you kind of have to go through these
Right.
multiple layers. In India, there are, for example, multiple layers for the smaller regions, smaller distributors. But if you want to go to just say maybe the urban cities and say, I just want to sell in the urban cities, you probably don't have to go to the second and the third level in India. You just can have one or two distributors that look at the urban areas. And so, in conclusion, what I would say is yes, certain countries, Japan, Korea, China, you have to go through. There's no other way.
Yeah.
In India, you can choose whether you want to use that to go to a more fragmented areas. From a regional distributor point of view, I can see companies trying to become this. For example, in Southeast Asia, there is no one single distributor for all the markets that are really, really good. There are,
There are few that claim that they can cover the
they
region.
claim, but they may not be very, very good. So that's one of the things. It's a tricky thing that we must navigate at this moment while we don't have a full-on, a distributor that's that strong.
Great point. Thanks for that. Quick reminder to our cohort companies on the webinar, feel free to queue up your questions. We'll get to them in about 15 minutes time or so, and we'll address them one by one. Adam, let's talk a bit about how to motivate distributors and what is it that drives what are good carrots in the US working with US distributors? Is it all about the margin they make, or are there other ways as well to motivate distributors, distributor partners, even independent reps in the US?
Yeah, I think it's one of those situations again where you have lots of different ways of doing things and lots of people have their own preferences and so forth. There's two very distinct levels that you're talking about there. Motivating a distributor could be very, very different from what you're doing to motivate an independent sales rep.
Yeah.
Different things drive them. Independent sales reps, there's a reason they're independent. They either want their freedom, maybe they only want to work 20 hours a week, or they're really aggressive and want to make $500,000 a month. Yeah, maybe not a month. And I think that's kind of where I come from when I say there's lots of different ways of doing it. Going into how are you going to motivate Medline or Cardinal Health? You're not, unless you've got some firecracker of a product that you are desperate to sell in massive volumes, and the world needs them in massive volumes. You're not going to. It's as simple as that. Your smaller ones, well, they're going to take a lot more interest, and the more effort you put into getting the right distributors, the easier it is. And as Ajish said, each relationship with each distributor is going to be different. There are going to be different motivators that motivate each rep company. One of them will be the one that's looking at it strategically, saying, this fits in with my portfolio.
Right.
The other one's going to look at it and say, well, this is a higher margin. I'm going to start pushing this one now. And some will be a tuck-in, a simple and easy tuck-in. Others will look at it and say, well, that brings me into a new market space that I'm not in. And that could be their motivation, that they're trying to work out a way of getting into, a particular area that they're not in at the moment. So I think it's down to a very personal kind of level. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all by any means.
Yeah.
Good point. Ajish, your thoughts on this for APAC?
And I've seen companies struggle with this. They say, okay, here's a margin, and they don't even know what the right margin should be or what the margin should include, what's included. So I see companies struggle with this. And this is just my point of view on this. What I'd say is start with a very small margin, right? It has to be a decent enough margin. If there's not enough margin, distributors are not going to touch your product. They're not going to push your product. So there has to be a decent amount of margin that goes in that actually is paying for like the sales effort, the logistics effort, and everything that they're doing. The layer above that would be something what I call performance incentives, right? And so you're saying, hey, you know what? if we're going to hit 1 million units in sales, here's, we're going to add an extra 3%, or there's going to be an extra $50,000 in it for you. So there's performance incentives that you can put on key products. As they say, I want A and B to be sold more, and so I'll give you a little bit more of a rebate if you sell A and B. There are performance incentives on key customers, and you say in a country, listen, I want these 3 hospitals because they are so say, oh, you know what, if you win these 3 hospitals, I'll give you a little bit of an incentive. So the next layer above is what I would call performance incentives.
Yeah.
And then the layer above could be what I call activity-based payments.
Okay.
And so this may be something that the distributor is, he or she, probably you're not the right priority, and so they are not willing to invest, but you want to invest. And this could be, for example, being in a particular conference, being present in a particular conference, or doing a particular marketing activity, which you really want them to do, and say, okay, if you do this work, I will give you X dollars. Now, instead of putting everything under margin and hoping the distributor will do all of this, you could say, okay, you know what, this is the margin, these are the performance incentives, and these are the activity-based payments that I can.
Right. And we'll support you for this one exhibition or conference, at this clinical meeting that otherwise maybe they wouldn't have attended.
That's that again, like Adam was pointing out, right? It's about how much is the distributor going to work for you?
Yeah.
And do they feel the incentive to do some work for you? Is key there.
Yeah. Excellent point. So we have just under 10 minutes left, and a couple of other things I wanted to make sure that we cover as well. One of them is maybe I'll turn to Adam first on this, and how you would recommend companies do this in the US. It's really about doing the due diligence on the distributor. What is it that a startup should think about when they evaluate potential distribution partners? What should they look for, and what are maybe some red flags?
Yeah, great question. I would say first thing to think about, and I believe this very strongly in pretty much anything you do in business, is do you feel that you can trust the organization you're working with? Trust is critical. It doesn't matter what contract you got. At the end of the day, if you don't trust the partners you're doing business with, then you've got to think of them as partners. If you don't trust them, then don't do business with them. It's as simple as that. And so the first thing I would say is make sure you can trust them. And that means you've got to build a relationship. So you need to build a relationship. You can't have one phone call with a distributor and then now you've found yourself the right people. It's not going to work that way. So then, being present, I think, is important, and attend meetings, meet them, visit them, see their facility, what they have, make sure that they actually have all the things they say. We hear a lot of AI fraud at the moment with, people making things that really pretty that don't actually exist. That's just going to get worse. So I'd say actually face to face and seeing something for yourself is probably going to become a heck of a lot more important in the future. What else is there? Obviously, you need to look at things like insurance. Make sure that they've got the right insurance coverage. That is absolutely critical. Insurance, as you know, in the US is probably more of an issue than it is in other countries because we are such a litigious nation. We just love suing people if we can. And what we do is we don't just sue the person who caused the problem. We sue everyone who's even smelling the problem from any direction. So if you're a distributor and the manufacturer's got an issue, you're getting sued alongside them. If you're their shipping company, you're probably going to get sued and all those. I mean, it just goes crazy. You've got to have defensible and collectible insurance. So make sure that you've got that. And that's going to apply in Asia as well. I mean, I know it's not quite as litigious, but at the end of the day, defensible and collectible is a big issue. You can say you've got insurance, but if you can never actually prosecute the company that needs to pay it out, it doesn't help. I think the other thing is you really need to talk to their other customers or their other distribution partners, manufacturing partners, get feedback. And then again, it comes back to that whole thing about, talk to the hospitals that they're supplying to. Are they reliable? Do they do what they say? Do they follow through? I think there's a lot of, and to be honest, you should have a process for it. We don't have a regulation here in the US that says you have to evaluate your distribution partners, but going the other way, your distribution partner has to evaluate you. And I would say, just from a common sense perspective, it should be a two-way street. You should absolutely make sure that they have the processes and the compliance requirements that you need. And that's compliance at federal and state level.
It's a great point. Thanks for that. Ajish, the due diligence process here for distributors in APAC, largely similar, or some major
Largely
differences?
similar, right? I mean, trust is very important.
Yeah. Insurance may be less of an issue.
Yeah, but there is one thing though that I would like to. So I'm assuming that all of the regular stuff, like like territorial coverage, sales capabilities, all of that exists. So I'm not going to go into those. There are a whole list of things that you need to consider.
Sure.
But there's two things one would also think about, right? One is, and Adam spoke about this a lot. Now, if you go to a really large distributor and you are less than 1% of their business, you are not going to get any attention, right? And you'll need to figure out how you can get the attention. The other alternative, you go to a smaller distributor and you are a big part of their business, and that means you will get a lot of attention. But in Asia Pacific, I would really ask people to watch out for financial stability of distributors. I have had this issue in Asia Pacific where I spent 7 months working with a distributor, launched a product. A month later, they were out of business. They, because of their cash flow, they did not have finances.
Yeah.
This happens in Asia, and especially in the developing markets. I would also really look at that as one of the financial stability of the distributor when you look at that. That's the only thing that I would add in addition to the usual what we expect. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a good point. And as we're wrapping up here, I did want to ask you as well, Ajish, about the whole area of technical service and how is that something that for someone that sells capital equipment, is that something that the same distributor needs to be able to provide? Is the diligence process for that slightly different? Do they need to have biomed engineers on board that you somehow need to vet? What's your experience in that arena?
And my experience is limited, but what I would say is that usually it's the same distributor that you want to be able to use. Again, because there is that relationship that the distributor has. There is that ownership that the distributor has towards that customer,
right?
That they need to provide it. So that the question of ownership and the relationship, even when you're selling these additional services, like whether it's if it's service contracts or parts and consumables or software upgrades, whatever it is. What I have seen is usually that the distributor is also handling this, and you're absolutely right. Then it goes to checking if the distributor has the capability to do all this work. And a lot of the times I've noticed that they don't. Right. And in which case you need to fly in your people and make sure that they are trained to do this work.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you for that. We are almost at the top of the hour. A closing question to each of you, and I'll start with Adam. We've covered a lot of ground during this 1 hour. We could talk a whole lot longer, no doubt. Any final tips, advice, maybe that we haven't covered, or something that you'd like to just re-emphasize for the companies that are on, the startup companies, the founders and CEOs on the call?
Absolutely. I'm going to say it again. I've said it already, and I said it right at the beginning. This is the 50 United States. We have 50 states. They all have their own rules. They are independent of federal regulations. I think one of my biggest frustrations is whenever you go to conferences and they talk about how to sell your products and get market clearance in the US, they talk about PMAs, they talk about exempt products, they talk about 510Ks. When do they ever talk about, well, you can't sell in California until you've registered with 2 organizations, and that can take up to 6 months. And you can only start the registration after you've got your approval from the FDA. I mean, that isn't mentioned. I never hear that. I don't think I've ever heard that at the conference. And that, I just think the most important bit of advice coming into the US as a foreign company is understand that we are multiple states with multiple different rules. We have lots of different rules that impact you. Everything from taxes to state board licensing to corporate rules. There's just lots of things to think about.
Good advice. Thank you for that, Adam. Ajish,
I think I'll
closing
end with
advice.
what we just started off with, where,
Yeah.
the absolute need to think early about what your customer type is, what your payment model is. Is it self-pay? Is it reimbursed pay? Really looking at what the commercial aspects of this much earlier in the game will really help. And I think definitely we should definitely do that. And another thing that I don't see a lot of startups do is build KOL relationships very, very, very early, and multiple KOL relationships. And it doesn't have to be a paid KOL relationship. But even if it's in a country, this is a senior clinician who's a KOL, reaching out to them, telling them what you're doing, trying to build relationships with KOLs early on. You don't have to make it paid, but just start that. If you can somehow get an introduction and say, hey, this is what we're doing. The relationships take time. And if you can build the KOL relationships, at least have some discussions, it'll put you in good stead when you need to get to that commercialization phase. So that's the only thing I'd say, that I don't see enough startups doing more of this. I think they should do more of this.
Great advice. Great advice. Well, thank you both so much. For I think all of our cohort companies on the call, you will be aware that we have the pleasure of having Ajish run a masterclass on sales and distribution on the 28th of October in conjunction with our grand finals event here in Singapore. So if you haven't signed up for that yet, please do so. You should have an email in your inbox to get signed up for that. Adam, Ajish, thank you both so much for joining us. Great discussion. Don't hang up. We'll go into Q&A in just a minute. But at this point, Bernice, I think we're ready to disconnect the live stream. Thank you to those of us